actually happened?
The chances of that are essentially zero, because where we found the dinghy and where we observed him standing next to the dinghy early on that Sunday morning, we have a clear location of where that is in Marsh Harbor, and it is nothing but scrub bush, very thick scrub bush, directly to the west. And if you walked a great distance, hundreds of yards through thick brush, there's nothing there. There's eventually a little commercial building. And again, this would have been happening at 4 o'clock on Sunday morning. There would be no lights back there. It would be like making a decision to walk through the deepest, darkest jungle, heading due west into the island. Where the other option is, if you wash up on this shore in your dinghy, for the last 30 minutes you will have seen, or even longer, you would have seen the boatyard at Calcutta 150 yards to the north, and that boatyard is extremely brightly lit up at night. I mean, it's a landmark at night. That boatyard is so lit up. So if you're coming across the water, whether you're being blown by the wind or blown and also paddling, the boatyard is a giant beacon. That's where to go. And if you were to get washed up on the beach, given the choice of going a reasonably short distance along the shore to the extremely bright lights and every reason to believe that there would be civilization and assistance, that's what you would do. The alternative would be to go south where there...
It happened at 9:30 at night, a moment when the Sea of Abaco usually surrenders to a heavy, unbroken silence. But on this particular evening, the water fractured. A witness sitting in one of the coastal homes, just 100 yards away from where the 46-foot sloop named Soulmate sat anchored, heard a massive, unmistakable splash rip through the darkness. A sound so violent and out of place in that quiet Bahamian harbor that it burned itself permanently into her memory. This single acoustic anomaly changes everything we thought we knew about the timeline of Lynette Hooker's disappearance, because it places a major physical disruption at the vessel more than 2 hours after her husband, Brian Hooker, claimed they had already abandoned the area in their small dinghy. For months, the public has been fed a narrative of a tragic boating mishap, a story of a wife supposedly bouncing off the back of a towed boat into the Black Ocean while her helpless husband drifted helplessly into the night. But this explosive new eyewitness account shatters that fragile timeline. If someone or something of significant weight went into the water directly beside Soulmate at 9:30, then the narrative that Brian has maintained to investigators, family members, and rescue officials is not just inaccurate, it is logistically impossible. Stay with me, because this is where it gets complicated, as we begin to peel back the layers of a story that was already deeply flawed, but has now crossed into the territory of a full-scale forensic breakdown. Think about that for a moment. An eyewitness hearing a heavy plunge into the sea at a time when Brian claimed he was already miles away, fighting the currents in a dead dinghy, having allegedly lost his wife to the waves hours earlier.
The rocks being very sharp on his feet. And I remember you telling me something very specific about what Brian was wearing when you rescued him that morning, just a few hours after he went up on the shore. What was he wearing that sort of doesn't go well with the whole description of the rocks being sharp on his feet?
He was wearing, I think the phrase that people use is sliders, but like a flip-flop.
Slides.
Slides, okay. He was wearing slides, and they're fairly common down here. What maybe people would think of as flip-flops or something like that. Some of the rock can be rough, and in pitch dark, it would be challenging to walk across the rock. Sometimes people refer to it as moon rock because it's kind of spiky from thousands of years of erosion. But the flip-flops or the slides would have made it, very practical to work your way across the rocks. You certainly wouldn't decide to go inland through the almost impenetrable bush versus staying on the rocks on the shore.
And you keep your slides on while going over all that rough rock. And by the way, Nathan has showed us incredible video of what that rock really looks like. It does look very sharp. You keep your slides on.
Sure. Yeah, you would definitely keep them on.
To truly understand the weight of this new development, we have to look closely at the geography of the Abacos and the physical reality of the boat the couple called home for 4 years. Soulmate was not just a weekend cruiser, it was a massive living space, a vessel fully integrated with technology, anchored within sight of lovely multi-million-dollar coastal homes whose residents routinely monitor the harbor. When Brian Hooker first reported his wife missing, he spun a terrifying tale of a sudden accident occurring much earlier in the evening, claiming that as they were traveling back to Soulmate from the Abaco Inn, Lynette simply vanished from the dinghy, taking the keys with her and leaving him with a dead engine. He claimed he was left to float blindly across the Sea of Abaco, completely powerless, eventually washing up on the distant shores of Marsh Harbor at 4 o'clock the following morning after a harrowing night at sea. For days, volunteer search teams, local authorities, and devastated family members operated entirely under the assumption that they were looking for a woman who had fallen overboard miles away in open water during the early evening hours. But this new witness testimony places the activity right back at the permanent anchorage of Soulmate at 9:30, creating a massive, unexplained 2-hour gap where Brian's official story completely detaches from the physical evidence on the ground. Ask yourself why that detail matters so much, and why a witness would remember a splash so clearly unless it carried the unmistakable weight of a catastrophic event occurring in a harbor that was otherwise dead silent.
Something of that sort.
Right. So on Sunday morning, I was on the front of the rescue boat. He and I had a lengthy discussion about where he believes Lynette went over the side on the dinghy. And in the process of trying to identify that, he said he drifted to the northern tip of Lovers. He finally threw out an anchor, and he stayed anchored there approximately an hour. He fired one flare or 2 flares. He fired a flare, 1 or more. I can't speak to the quantity, but he fired a flare from.
He told Darlene he fired 2 flares, and there's information that he only fired 1. That the actual flare may have only fired 1. I don't have that 100% confirmed, but there is information that only 1 flare went out of that gun, but he said to Darlene that he fired 2.
Right. So he fired a flare or a combination of flares, and then eventually he told me, and so I had my 1 broken oar, and I decided I would paddle to the northern tip of Lovers and find a house and break in and use the telephone to call for help. And when I raised the anchor to get to Lovers, I was unable to get to make land, and then consequently got blown west to where he came up on the beach. That's what he.
This revelation does not exist in a vacuum. It lands at the exact same moment that the United States Coast Guard Investigative Service has reportedly uncovered what sources are calling a forensic gold mine on board the Soulmate itself. After Brian Hooker fled the Bahamas under a cloud of intense suspicion and mounting pressure from local authorities, the 46-foot sloop was eventually towed back to a Coast Guard station in Fort Pierce, Florida, where federal agents immediately wrapped it in yellow crime scene tape. Images of federal investigators moving on and off the vessel, carrying out boxes of evidence, signaled to the world that this was no longer a simple missing persons case being handled by a small island constabulary. Brian, described by those close to the family as a self-proclaimed tech nerd who was obsessed with networking his boat, had packed Soulmate with an advanced array of electronic equipment, including tablets, computers, and sophisticated navigation systems. More importantly, investigators have focused their attention on the vessel's dual engines, which are equipped with highly advanced internal telemetrics capable of syncing directly to a mobile phone to track exact runtimes, battery levels, and power usage down to the precise second. This means that while Brian was crafting a story of a dark, unpredictable ocean and a sequence of chaotic, unverified events, the boat's own internal computers were quietly recording the absolute truth of when those engines were started, how long they ran, and exactly where they were positioned.
No, the splash was definitely later, maybe even past 9:30, because the person I was talking to said that the surroundings had become quiet so that one would have been able to hear a splash prior to that, there was more general commotion, just general island life commotion on the land.
So the splash was after 9:30 when things had become more quiet and the splash would be easier to hear.
Yes.
Wow, that is a lot of information to process. Just super alarming, but also fitting into a puzzle that, that we've been working out, and that puzzle increasingly does not fit Brian Hooker's story.
Right. Yeah. And this goes to me, this goes so many data points there. The story is so implausible. Now it's trying to triangulate on what really did happen. And so if a flare was shot in sometime after 8 o'clock, and if there was a distinctly loud splash sometime later than 9 o'clock, maybe 9:30, then those are extremely compelling data points in what might have actually taken place.
The tension between Brian's spoken narrative and the emerging digital and physical evidence is creating a profound sense of unease within the tight-knit community of the Abacos, where residents pride themselves on their deep knowledge of the local waters. Jim Todd, a dedicated volunteer with the Hopetown Volunteer Fire and Rescue, who was one of the very first people to pull a stranded Brian Hooker from the shore on Sunday morning, has recently stepped forward with devastating logistical critiques of Brian's claims. Todd, who has been hailed as a central figure in the pursuit of truth for Lynette, was on the rescue vessel from the earliest moments of the crisis, observing Brian's behavior, his physical condition, and the exact state of the environment where he claimed to have suffered his ordeal. According to Todd, almost every single element of the story Brian told his mother-in-law, Darlene Hamlet, regarding his actions after washing ashore at Marsh Harbor completely falls apart when subjected to basic geographic analysis. Brian claimed that after his terrifying night of drifting, he finally hit the beach at Marsh Harbor, dragged himself ashore, and desperately sought help by knocking on 2 residential doors in a nearby subdivision, only to receive no answer before being ignored by a passing car. But those who know the topography of Marsh Harbor know that the reality of that shoreline makes this sequence of events look less like a desperate search for rescue and more like a carefully constructed fabrication. What do you believe happened in those dark hours between the time the couple left the inn and the moment the witness heard that heavy splash near the hull of the Soulmate? Do you think the digital footprint locked inside the boat's telemetrics will finally provide the answers that Lynette's family has been praying for? Or are we looking at a timeline that has been permanently obscured by design? Please share your thoughts and theories in the comments below, because analyzing these contradictions is the only way to ensure that Lynette's story is not swallowed by the passing of time. This is where things get serious, because as we transition from the initial shock of the missing person report to a rigorous step-by-step examination of the physical terrain, the cracks in the official narrative begin to widen into an unavoidable chasm. The contrast between a community of volunteers risking their lives to search the ocean based on a specific timeline, and a husband whose story shifts against the physical laws of the very island he inhabited, underscores the deep emotional weight of this ongoing investigation. We are not just looking at a dispute over minutes and hours. We are looking at a fundamental conflict between a manufactured defense and the stubborn, unyielding facts of a Bahamian night. If you believe that Lynette Hooker's story deserves international attention and that the truth must be pursued no matter where it leads, please take a brief moment to like this video, share it with others who follow investigative journalism, and subscribe to the channel so you do not miss a single update as this federal investigation unfolds in real time. To understand the sheer implausibility of the survival story Brian Hooker presented to his family, one must look at the brutal, unyielding geography of the Marsh Harbor shoreline where his dinghy eventually grounded at 4 o'clock that Sunday morning. Jim Todd, who pulled Brian onto the rescue vessel, points out that the area directly to the west of where Brian stood is an immense, nearly impenetrable wall of thick, jungle-like scrub bush. To suggest that a man traumatized and exhausted from watching his wife drown could navigate through hundreds of yards of this pitch-black, thorny labyrinth in the dead of night is logistically absurd. There were no streetlights, no pathways, and no clear lines of sight. It was an environment of absolute darkness that would consume anyone attempting to breach it. Furthermore, even if Brian had attempted to circumvent the thickest brush by traveling south toward the residential community known as Sweetings Village, his path would have been completely blocked by a natural water inlet. In the pitch black of 4 in the morning, with no flashlight and no knowledge of the terrain's hidden traps, crossing this terrain on foot to reach the 30-odd homes in that subdivision is a physical impossibility. Yet, Brian insisted to his mother-in-law that he managed to bypass these natural barriers, locate the subdivision, and knock on the doors of 2 separate homes in a desperate bid to get help. Think about that for a moment, because this is where the human element of the story clashes violently with the geographic reality of the Abacos. The homes in Sweeting's village are not isolated, seasonal vacation rentals that sit empty for 10 months out of the year. They are the permanent residences of hard-working, tight-knit Bahamian families. In a small island society where community safety and mutual aid are deeply ingrained cultural pillars, the idea that a bloodied, frantic American voter could knock on 2 separate doors at 4 in the morning and be met with absolute silence is entirely unprecedented. If a resident in that neighborhood had heard someone pounding on their door in obvious distress, they would have either opened it immediately to provide aid or, at the very least, looked through the window and called the local police to report an emergency. Brian's narrative asks the world to believe that a neighborhood of active, protective residents simply ignored a man screaming for help during a life-or-death crisis involving his missing wife. But the deception becomes even more glaring when you realize that Brian didn't just claim the homeowners ignored him. He claimed that after failing at those 2 houses, he simply gave up, turned around, and walked back through the difficult, hazardous terrain toward the beach. Ask yourself why that detail matters, and why any rational human being looking for a telephone to save their dying spouse would abandon a neighborhood of 30 homes after trying only 2. The alternative path available to Brian that morning makes his decision to enter the dark jungle even more incomprehensible to rescue officials. Just a mere 150 yards to the north of where his dinghy washed ashore sits the Kolkata Boatyard, a massive commercial maritime facility that serves as a permanent landmark for anyone navigating the harbor. At night, this facility is not dark or abandoned. It is blindingly illuminated by high-powered security floodlights that cut through the Bahamian night like a massive shoreline beacon. Anyone coming across the water, whether they were being pushed by the natural trajectory of the wind or actively paddling with a broken oar, would have seen those bright lights glowing from miles away. Once his feet touched the shore, Brian had a clear, undeniable choice: walk a short, direct distance along the rocky coastline toward a brilliantly lit center of civilization, or turn his back on the light and march into a dark, impenetrable jungle. Jim Todd notes that the instinct to move toward light and civilization during a crisis is an overwhelming, universal human reaction. Yet Brian's story requires us to believe he actively chose the darkest, most dangerous path available. This brings us to one of the most damning physical contradictions discovered by the rescue team the moment they pulled Brian from the shoreline, a detail involving his clothing and his complaints about the local terrain. Brian told his mother-in-law that the coastline was treacherous, claiming that the sharp, spiky rock formations commonly known in the islands as moon rock were tearing up his feet and making it excruciatingly difficult to walk. This moon rock is the result of thousands of years of heavy saltwater erosion, creating a landscape of razor-sharp stone needles that can easily slice through human flesh and thin fabrics. However, when Jim Todd and the rescue crew pulled Brian onto their boat just a few hours after he supposedly traveled across this terrain, they noticed something that completely neutralized his excuse about the sharp rocks. Brian was wearing sliders, heavy, thick-soled slip-on sandals that are incredibly common throughout the islands and provide substantial protection against the rough coastal environment. With these sliders firmly on his feet, walking the short, open distance along the rocky shore toward the bright lights of the Kolkata Boatyard would have been entirely practical and relatively easy. There is absolutely no physical reason for him to abandon the shoreline in favor of the thick, thorny inland bush, a fact that forces investigators to consider whether the entire journey into the jungle was invented to explain a massive, unaccounted-for delay in reporting Lynette's disappearance. What do you think of this stark contrast between the physical reality of the Marsh Harbor shoreline and the survival narrative Brian presented to the family? Do you believe a person in a genuine state of panic could truly make decisions that defy basic human survival instincts? Or does this footwear discrepancy suggest a much more calculated attempt to control the timeline? Please drop your perspectives in the comments section below, because your insights help dismantle the noise surrounding this case and keep the focus on the undeniable facts. Stay with me because this is where it gets complicated, as we move away from the shoreline and follow Brian's narrative out into the open waters near Lubber's quarters, where his claims regarding his attempts to signal for help encounter an entirely new set of logistical roadblocks. The deeper investigators dig into the physical parameters of the Bahamas, more they find that nature itself refuses to cooperate with Brian's version of events. If you believe that investigative deep dives like this are crucial for exposing the truth and ensuring that victims of maritime tragedies are never forgotten, please take a second to share this video on social media and subscribe to the channel so we can continue to bring you the unfiltered reality of this developing case. The logistical anomalies multiply exponentially when we analyze Brian Hooker's claims regarding his actions while stranded out in the open waters near the northern tip of Lubber's quarters. According to the timeline he provided to Lynette's mother, Darlene Hamlet, after his wife allegedly fell from the dinghy, he found himself drifting aimlessly with a single broken oar and no mechanical power. He claimed that he eventually drifted to the northern tip of Lubber's Quarters, where he threw out an anchor and remained stationary for approximately an hour in a desperate attempt to summon help. During this hour of supposed isolation, Brian stated that he used his emergency flare gun to fire flares into the night sky, hoping to alert passing vessels or residents living on the nearby keys. However, this segment of his narrative immediately collides with the physical reality of the local maritime geography, a detail that seasoned boaters and local rescue teams find impossible to ignore. The northern tip of Lubber's Quarters is not a deep water abyss. It is home to a massive notorious shoal that extends far out into the Sound, creating a sandbar so shallow that it is universally avoided by anyone operating a vessel in the Abacos. Think about that for a moment, because this changes everything we thought we knew about Brian's alleged state of helplessness during that critical hour. Jim Todd and other experienced mariners familiar with the area confirmed that at the northern tip of Lubber's Quarters, the water depth drops so significantly that 50 yards out from the shoreline, a full-grown adult can easily step out of a boat and stand up with the water barely reaching their chest. If Brian's dinghy had truly drifted to the northern tip of the island where he allegedly anchored for an hour, he was not trapped in a perilous deep ocean current. He was sitting directly on top of a shallow sandbar. Instead of sitting in a dead dinghy for 60 minutes firing flares into the blackness, he could have simply stepped over the side of the small plastic vessel, planted his feet firmly on the sandbar, and walked safely to the dry shore of Lubber's Quarters. The shore itself was not an uninhabited wilderness. It featured several residential homes equipped with landlines and VHF radios, which Brian claimed he intended to break into to call for help, yet he never actually made landfall. Instead, Brian claimed that the moment he pulled up his anchor to finally attempt a landing on Lubber's Quarters, the wind and currents immediately overpowered his single broken oar, sweeping him entirely away from the island and forcing him on a miles-long drift across the Sea of Abaco toward Marsh Harbor. To anyone who understands the behavior of coastal currents in this specific region of the Bahamas, this explanation feels entirely far-fetched. If a boater is securely anchored on a shallow sandbar just yards from an island, pulling that anchor while fully aware that they have no engine power and only a broken oar, thereby surrendering their stable position to an unpredictable current, defies basic common sense. It raises a haunting question that investigators are forced to confront. Was the anchor ever truly dropped at Lubber's Quarters? Or was this entire sequence created to explain why hours passed before Brian finally arrived at Marsh Harbor to alert authorities? This brings us to the deeply troubling discrepancy surrounding the emergency flares that Brian claimed he fired during his hour of entrapment near the shoal. He told his mother-in-law that he fired 2 distinct flares into the sky, a claim that initially seemed to align with reports from a small group of local witnesses who remembered seeing a flare around 8 o'clock that evening. But as investigators have added more resolution to the flare story, the physical trajectory and the lack of widespread reports have become a major point of contention. If an emergency marine flare is fired properly into the open sky over the Sea of Abaco, it climbs to an altitude where it becomes visible to dozens of homes, passing water taxis, and surrounding keys, triggering an immediate flood of emergency calls to the volunteer fire and rescue teams. Yet, on the night Lynette vanished, there was no mass alert, a lack of response that Jim Todd attributed to the specific direction and altitude of the signal. Emerging information suggests that only a single flare may have actually left the gun, and its low trajectory prevented it from being seen by the wider community. Ask yourself why a man who is genuinely watching his wife drown would fire his emergency signals in a manner that virtually guaranteed they would go unnoticed by the surrounding islands. The contrast between Brian's frantic text message descriptions of the event and the rigid mathematical reality of the wind, water depths, and witness observations is pushing this investigation into a darker phase. At this point in the narrative, the sheer volume of geographical and physical contradictions ceases to look like the erratic mistakes of a panic survivor and begins to look like a deliberate attempt to manipulate the geography of the Bahamas. What do you believe really happened out on that shallow sandbar near Lubber's Quarters on the night Lynette disappeared? Do you think Brian was truly at the mercy of the wind, or do these water depth realities suggest that his dinghy was never actually anchored where he claimed? Please share your analysis in the comments below, because your theories help keep this investigation alive and ensure that the pressure for real answers never wavers. Stay with me because this is where things get serious, as we look at the final, most egregious claim in Brian's survival narrative, the sudden appearance of a mystery vehicle on a deserted early morning road. The final piece of Brian Hooker's survival narrative completely detaches from the reality of island life when he describes his alleged encounter with a passing vehicle on the deserted outskirts of Marsh Harbor. He claimed that after navigating the dense scrub bush, avoiding the inlets, and failing to rouse the residents of Sweetings Village, he finally made his way to a roadway where he managed to flag down a passing car at 4 o'clock on Sunday morning. According to Brian, he stood in the middle of the road in obvious frantic distress, signaling for help, only for the unknown driver to suddenly accelerate and speed away into the darkness, leaving him entirely abandoned. To anyone who has spent a single night in the Abacos, this story is not just highly improbable, it approaches a mathematical probability of 0. At 4 o'clock on a Sunday morning in that specific quiet pocket of Marsh Harbor, commercial activity is completely dead and residential traffic is virtually non-existent. There are no 24-hour convenience stores, no late-night industrial shifts, and no through traffic that would place a random anonymous motorist on those specific back roads in the deepest hours of the night. Think about that for a moment, because this is where the cultural fabric of the Bahamas fundamentally rejects Brian's claims. The Abacos is a deeply interconnected small-scale community where anonymity is rare and mutual assistance on the road is an absolute rule of survival. If a local resident had actually been driving through that area at 4 in the morning and encountered a white American boater standing in the headlights in a state of clear, visible terror, the idea that they would simply speed off without a word is entirely counter to the character of the people who live there. Even if the driver had been gripped by a sudden wave of personal fear, island safety protocols and basic human decency dictate that they would have immediately rolled down their window to investigate, or at the very least, utilize their mobile phone to alert the local police the moment they reached a safe distance. Yet, despite the massive international media storm that has engulfed the story of Lynette Hooker's disappearance, not a single person has ever come forward to claim they were that mystery driver. In a tight-knit territory where secrets are almost impossible to keep, the absolute silence surrounding this alleged vehicle strongly suggests to investigators that the car, much like the journey through the jungle, existed only in Brian's spoken defense. The painful irony of this manufactured narrative is the stark, devastating contrast between Brian's claims of being ignored by the community and the heroic, exhausting reality of what the local volunteers actually went through to find his wife. While Brian was sitting under the shelter of a local porch for 2 full days, seemingly content to let others do the heavy lifting without demanding a vessel to join the search, the people of the Abacos were launching hell and high water to find Lynette. Jim Todd's own wife, Cindy, embodies the selfless community spirit. Upon hearing a vague, unconfirmed rumor from a second homeowner about an old overgrown cistern on a distant string of keys near Tulu Cut, she immediately dropped everything. She climbed into a kayak and paddled an exhausting 3 miles through open water, navigating right up to the jagged shoreline of those deserted keys, pushing her body to the absolute limit just to eliminate a single, far-fetched possibility of where a missing woman might be trapped. This is the true face of the Bahamian community, an unyielding, proactive dedication to the preservation of life that stands in direct opposition to the cold, distant, and logistically flawed timeline put forth by the man who was supposed to love Lynette the most. As the days turn into weeks, the focus of the investigation has taken a dark, permanent turn away from a standard rescue mission and toward the meticulous scientific location of a hidden grave site. While volunteer drones initially swept the northern cliffs and open beaches of Lubbers Quarters looking for a survivor, international teams equipped with advanced U.S. Coast Guard cadaver dogs have shifted their attention to a heavily disturbed peninsula on Elbow Key known as the Sanctuary Development. Located just south of the White Sound Channel, this area is currently a chaotic landscape of heavy machinery, constant road grading, intense palm tree planting, and aggressively churned earth. Jim Todd notes that searching this particular topography is an absolute nightmare because the constant construction means everything naturally looks like a freshly dug grave, creating a visual minefield of false leads. Yet, the intense interest displayed by the forensic K9 units along those low-lying cliff formations and mangrove roots suggests that the earth may be holding secrets that no amount of construction can permanently mask. This case remains a profoundly open, bleeding wound for the family of Lynette Hooker and the volunteers who risked everything on a timeline that was broken from the very start. We are left with a chilling realization that the physical laws of the ocean, the water depths of the shoals, the footwear on a rescued man's feet, and the silent, digital telemetrics of the Soulmate's engines all tell a completely different story than the one spun in the middle of the night. What do you believe is the most damning piece of physical evidence uncovered in this update? And do you think federal investigators now have everything they need to bring definitive closure to Lynette's family? Please share your final theories and deep dive analysis in the comments below, because the truth only surfaces when we refuse to let the narrative be controlled by those who wish it to remain hidden. If you believe that investigative journalism must continue to push past the lies and fight for the memory of Lynette Hooker, please share this video across your true crime networks, subscribe to the channel, and keep your notifications on, because this federal investigation is moving at a rapid pace, and the final chapter of this Bahamian mystery is far from over.